I can only count to 4. I can only count to 4. I can only count to 4. I can only count to...
Andere Seite. He's dead as fuck.
Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, and today I'm happy to bring you my guide on Advanced Prototype PowerTech, or Tactics Vanguard if you're playing the Republic version. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. APPT right now is one of the best, if not the best melee class in the game for PvP. Its strengths include one of the best bursts in the game, and even though it has been nerfed a little in the previous patch, it's still up there as one of the strongest bursts in the game together with Engineering Sniper. That is because of the delay on the damage of Thermal Detonator, the fact that you can stack your offensive cooldowns, that Shoulder Cannon is off the global cooldown, and the fact that you can reset your energy burst with power yield. Putting all that together, you can do up to 300,000 damage in 3 global cooldowns, which is crazy, as you have seen in the intro. On top of that, APPT has a pull, it has stuns, actually with Carbonize, the only AoE stun in the game, shared with the other PowerTech specs. It has passive slows if it chooses to, and is great for shutting down healers with one of the most broken tacticals in the game. Putting these two things together means that it's probably the best class to really carry teamfights and roll over an enemy team. On top of that, APPT has 15 meters range since 7.0, which makes it incredibly hard to kite, and also means that it can deal with lag or low FPS better than other melee classes. PowerTech has 2 stun breaks, which makes it hard to shut down and means that you can get your burst off more reliably. On the side of weaknesses, I would say if you're afraid of dying, this is not the class for you, because you need to be committed to blowing up a target, being in the middle of 5 people, hitting that Carbonize so your team can follow up and AoE everyone. You're often the front line. The entire enemy team will try to kill you for it. And as a PowerTech, you really have not many ways out. You don't have Phase Walk, you don't have something like Force Cloak or Force Barrier. So you need to commit. And the fact is that as APPT, you can get tunneled. And in fact, that is how BioWare intended it. That is exactly how APPT is meant to be played. The devs even gave it its own mechanic to increase your damage when you're being attacked, but a little bit more about that later. And I guess another weakness would be that heat management can be hard for new players. So this class requires a little bit of restraint, and in order to master it, you need to know when you can overheat, when you cannot, and when you are in danger of overheating, planning your rotation a little bit ahead. Taking a look at the key abilities. First one, Explosive Fuel, is in my opinion the best offensive cooldown in the game. It takes your damage from pretty good to insane for a total of 15 seconds. And whenever you have this up, you can kill someone. Carbonize, already mentioned this, the only AoE stun in the game outside of grenades. A good one can win a team fight. Your team will do more damage while all the enemies are stunned and cannot move out of AoEs, for example. And their team obviously will do no damage since they're being stunned. Next key ability, Prototype Particle Accelerator. This is probably the most important one actually, because it finishes the cooldown on your Railshot. It makes the next Railshot generate no heat and effectively reduces its cooldown to 6 seconds or 4 global cooldowns. Keep in mind that this is affected by alacrity. This is very important because it allows your rotation to be heat neutral, and in combination with Retractable Blade on the target, you can sustain your rotation indefinitely if you're a little bit careful. Last but not least, Energy Burst. The 4th key ability and your biggest damage button. It will always crit, and it works based off energy loads, which you can stack up to 4 times. And once you have these 4 stacks, that's exactly when you want to use it. Of course, there are 4 different ways in which you can build energy loads. First one being Railshot, the second one being Power Yield, which instantly gives you 4 energy loads. The third one, Recharge and Reload, which you want to use before every fight. And the fourth one, you build energy loads when you get critically hit under power yield, which by the way is currently bugged on PowerTech, but it works fine on Vanguard. Moving on, these are the legendaries which I use. Shock Trooper, hands down, is the best one. Take note that it reduces the energy cost of Rocket Punch by 4, which makes Rocket Punch more energy efficient and the most efficient way to proc your prototype particle accelerator. Mandalorian armaments, I don't use this anymore. I included it here because it is the best for PvE, parsing on the dummy, and in a theoretical perfect scenario, this does the most damage. Why I don't use it in PvP is because in a warzone, you don't always want to use shoulder cannon on cooldown. So that makes it a little bit worse. Sometimes you want to save your shoulder cannon to get a kill. You want to delay it until fuel is ready again to stack your cooldowns. All of which means that in PvP, Mandalorian armaments is just a bit worse than it is in PvE. Another note in Mandalorian armaments, it can be really annoying when the autocannon sometimes breaks a sorcerer bubble and stuns you, or breaks a soft CC and keeps your teammates from capping. Veteran Ranger is what I use in PvP mostly. It's pretty nice because it basically just gives you more burst when you want it, and AP is of course a burst class, so it just makes your strength better. Finally, I would recommend that you keep Super Commando Package in your inventory in case you want to play Arena. This one is really nice because it gives you a 3-second invulnerability, gives you a huge shield that pretty much nothing can come through. It is also great if you're getting focused a lot. You can use this, but keep in mind that it will lead to some damage loss for sure. Tacticals, there are 4 which I recommend. The first one, Neural Trigger. I have a separate video about that, why it's OP and why I think it's one of the most broken tacticals in the game. Use this if you want to win or if you want to make people really mad and just hate the game. Flame Detonation is actually really fun and can be really good for damage farming in an AoE situation. But overall, Neural Trigger is just better, so these days I mostly use that. Life Warden is always good to have if you want to play Arena and it comes down to the wire in the 3rd round. You usually being the focus target in Arena, it's nice to have Life Warden on hand. And then finally, if you're doing PvE, or you don't care about winning, you just want to farm the maximum single target damage, Overwhelming Offense is a good option. Moving on to gear, nothing too special here. You can use the 332 Thursian gear, you can use the 332 or 336 mods from Hide and Seek. They are pretty much equal as far as PvP is concerned, so just make sure you get those. Make sure you get the Thursian relics because they give you a little bit more power than the PvE ones. When it comes to stats, I pretty much run full crit these days combined with the 1.4 GCD, around 2200 alacrity. I don't run any accuracy after a lot of testing. It's simply not worth it, even though Railshot will be your highest damage ability on a parse and in some war zones. But 80% of your damage is yellow, which is not affected by accuracy. So overall, it's just not worth it, and you want to stack more crit to again maximize your burst windows. Moving on to the build. This is what I play most of the time. However, there are some variations here. The first option, normally I go with Retracted Refresh. Retracted Refresh is really good because it procs a full instance of Retractable Blade, not the dot, but the initial hit, on secondary targets within 5 meters if you are refreshing the bleed effect from Retractable Blade. So it might be a little bit difficult to understand what it does. Maybe I'll do a separate video on exactly how it works, but basically you can keep in mind that in an AoE situation, this is way better than Jugular. And in a single target situation, it is worse because you're missing this, whatever it is, 3500 bonus kinetic damage. So even in a single target situation, Retracted Refresh is not that much of a damage loss. And in an AoE situation, it is way better. Level 27, I always take Jet Charge, which is your leap, except for Hardball, where I take Manhunter. Level 39, you have 2 options. Power Burst is better for single target damage, and I mostly use this one. If you want to hardcore farm AoE damage, you can run Heat Zone. However, the additional energy burst will not hit for full damage, so that makes it a little bit less attractive. At level 43, in almost all of the cases, I take Advanced Yield, which will give you 15 meter range on your most important abilities, which is great. Also, it will mean that you have your power yield up a little bit more often, which is an added bonus, but mostly the 50 meters makes you really hard to kite, makes it so even if you get knocked back, you are usually still in range of something, so you can always hit someone. And that just means more DPS. Level 51, if you're playing Warzones, I would really recommend to take the gyros. They will give you a lot of additional heat when you get CC'd, which makes heat management easier, especially for new players. If you're confident you get tunneled a lot or you're playing Arena, you can run Pyro Shield for some extra damage. This is also the best option in PvE, by the way. Level 64, you have a couple of options. If you're running Neural Trigger, I would not run Suppressive Tools because you will basically waste the slow from Neural Dart. And since as a PowerTech, usually you want to be in the middle of people fighting them, Reflective Armor is a great way to do some additional passive damage. Level 68, this is a tough choice. Of course, we would like to take Electro Dart, but outside of some situations, maybe in a pre-made arena, when you're getting focused, Hydraulic Overrides is just too important. It gives you full immunity, it gives you crazy movement speed, can get you out of a sticky situation, or just make it so you get your fuel off, you get your burst off on a target that tries to kite you. Hydraulic Overrides is simply too good to pass up, so I pretty much always take this. And then on level 73, again, Efficient Suit, really good talent. This gives you the second stun break on Call to Overload, and it also increases the range of your grapple by 10 meters, shoulder cannon included. So this is really OP in my opinion, pulling people from 40 meters away when they don't expect it sometimes. Really good talent, and I think only the second stun break already makes it worth to take this one. Okay, moving on. This is the opener which I typically use when going into a Warzone. Thermal Detonator, since it has 30 meter range. Magnetic Blast to proc your Shock Trooper implant, followed by a Neural Dart if you're running Neural Trigger, which you should. Then you pop Explosive Fuel. This will buff the damage of your Energy Burst and your Shoulder Cannons, which you're gonna spam. After Energy Burst, you reset the cooldown with a Power Yield. Make sure to hit the Power Yield button before Thermal Detonator goes off for the extra damage buff. Then you want to use a Rocket Punch, and the reason for that is that Energy Burst has, of course, a direct damage component, which is the big hit that you see, but then it also has a damage or over time component, which ticks for 3 seconds. So if we would be using 2 consecutive Energy Bursts, we would be wasting this dot since they don't stack, they override. So instead what I typically do is I space out the Energy Bursts, use my Rocket Punch in between, which has the added effect of putting the armor reduction debuff on the target, so the second Energy Burst will hit a little bit harder. However, sometimes I will still use the 2 consecutive Energy Bursts if I want to secure a kill or I just want to get the damage off before the target has time to use a defensive cooldown, and I don't really care about maximizing my DPS. Anyway, this opener is kind of a compromise because in PvE, you want to use a different opener that does a little bit more DPS, in a perfect scenario. But in PvP, I believe that what's more important than maximizing every little bit of theoretical DPS, especially for AP, it's about getting your burst off before the enemy has time to react and can use a defensive cooldown, which negates a large part of your damage. AP is really all about the burst windows, making sure you get the maximum value out of your explosive fuel and your shoulder cannon. So this is what I use. I call it the quick opener. There is different openers that I might discuss in a later video. But to be honest, if you use this opener, at this point, after the 5th global cooldown, the enemy is either dead if you have a teammate helping on him, or he has to use a big cooldown, so you're going to be target swapping anyway. Okay, priorities. So in an AoE situation, if you're running Flame Detonation, then you want to make sure to use the Thermal Detonator Flame Sweep combo on cooldown, since it will be your highest damage. Second priority is to use Retractable Blade if the target is going to live more than, let's say, 3 or 4 global cooldowns. Retractable Blade is really good because, as I already mentioned, Retracted Refresh will proc its full damage on all targets within 5 meters of the main target. Make sure you dot up as many people as possible and then use Shatter Slug preferably or Railshot to proc the AoE damage. Shatter Slug is preferred because of the level 51 passive, which is called Prototype Missile Silos, which makes it so Shatter Slug refreshes your Retractable Blade on all targets that already have it, which then in turn triggers Retracted Refresh. So a really good way to do a lot of AoE damage if people are stacking, so you want to make sure to use those. And they do have priority over Deadly Onslaught. When it comes to single target, the number one most important thing to keep in mind is to always keep proccing your Railshot via Prototype Particle Accelerator. This needs to happen every 4th global cooldown, and this is exactly where the count to 4 meme also comes from. So you want to make sure that every 4 global cooldowns you are using either Rocket Punch, preferably, Magnetic Blast, Flame Sweep if there's no target within range that you can hit with another ability, or Shatter Slug if there's more than one target that you can hit. Those 4 abilities must be used every time you have the chance to proc Prototype Particle Accelerator. This is the number one priority because, as I already said, this makes your Railshot free, and this is the only way you can keep your rotation going and keeping it heat negative. Second priority for me is using Retractable Blade if the target is going to live more than 4 to 5 global cooldowns. So don't use this if the target is already at 5%. But this is really important. It is the second most important thing, and it helps to sustain your rotation, keep your rotation heat negative because of the level 43 passive Prototype Rail, which makes it so Railshot vents 5 heat whenever it hits a bleeding target. And of course, Retractable Blade will be our main way to apply the bleed. Number 3, Energy Burst. This is your main hitter, but nevertheless, you will skip an Energy Burst and delay it if you have a chance to proc your Railshot or the target doesn't have Retractable Blade yet. However, using Energy Burst when you have 4 stacks is really important because you never want to waste a stack. Energy Burst will auto-crit, so it will be your highest damaging ability per activation. However, it does cost 20 heat, so yeah, make sure that you can afford it and that you manage your heat accordingly. A little bit more about that in a second. The next priority would be using Railshot. However, you don't have to use this on cooldown since effectively the cooldown is tied to this 4 global cooldown block in which you can proc it. So whether you use it in position 1 after the proc or in position 4 just before you proc it again, it doesn't matter as long as you use it in this 4 global cooldown block. Railshot is really great, will do a lot of damage, but it is your only white hit, so sometimes you can miss if you use it on a tank especially. However, it does ignore 30% of the armor, so against those heavy armor targets, it actually can do more damage than you expect. Next up, Thermal Detonator will do more damage than Railshot, so sometimes you will prioritize it over Railshot. However, this is why I made this addition here. Make sure you use Railshot in order to manage your heat. And you never want to waste Railshot since it's responsible for a lot of things. Building the energy loads, venting your heat. So you want to make sure that if you haven't used Railshot and your next proc is coming up, you use Railshot, and if you have to, even delay Thermal Detonator. However, Thermal Detonator will do a lot of damage. It will also put a 5% damage buff for tech attacks on the enemy target, which is really nice. So make sure you use it, preferably on a target that is going to live more than 3 global cooldowns, because that's the time that it takes for Thermal Detonator to go off. And yeah, if the target dies before, then you wasted one of your highest damaging abilities. Next up, Rocket Punch. So if you're running the Shock Trooper package, then this will be a very energy efficient attack. It does a little bit more damage than Magnetic Blast. It puts the Sundered armor debuff on the target, and of course it procs your Prototype Particle Accelerator, so it has higher priority than Magnetic Blast. Mag Blast is your main filler. The most important thing to keep in mind here is that you never want to use it if you're above 25 heat. There's also a case where your Energy Burst for stacks is about to come up and your Thermal Detonator is about to be off cooldown. In this case, you want to skip Magnetic Blast if you're around 15 to 20 heat and just use Rapid Shots instead. So this is an example of how a rotation can look. The first global cooldown will always be a skill that procs the Prototype Particle Accelerator, aka your free Railshot. So let's say we're starting with a Rocket Punch. It will be Rocket Punch, And assuming we already have 4 stacks of energy burst, we still want to make sure to use Retractable Blade first, because again, that's going to buff all of our damage via the Blood Tracker passive. It's going to make it so our next Railshot will vent heat. So we want to use it, delaying energy burst by 1 global cooldown. Next up, we have 4 energy loads, so we want to use our main hitter energy burst. And then the last attack will be Railshot, even though Thermal Detonator is available, because Railshot will vent heat and our next proc is about to come up. On the 1, we proc our next Railshot. So here we're using Mag Blast, followed by a Thermal Detonator, and just in time, our Rocket Punch comes off cooldown. So we're using Rocket Punch, followed by a Railshot. So Railshot is being delayed 2 global cooldowns. That's fine. You don't always need to use Railshot as soon as it's available, as long as you use it within those 4 global cooldowns. So before the next proc. So then again, 1, we're proccing our Railshot with a Mag Blast. And now we're using Railshot immediately because we have no higher priority available. And we need to manage our heat. So we're using Railshot, followed by Rapid Shots because our heat is getting into a critical area, followed by another Mag Blast. And then again, the 1 comes up and conveniently our Rocket Punch is off cooldown, so we're using it, followed by a Railshot to vent our heat, followed by Rapid Shots, and then finally our Thermal Detonator is off cooldown, so we're using it without delay. Okay, so here's an example of what not to do and how you can mess up your heat even if you're being careful. We are in the 3 spot right now of our rotation, and as you can see, Thermal Detonator is about to come off cooldown, and we have 4 stacks of energy loads. Now, even though we're at 0 heat here, what we should be doing is using Rapid Shots. But instead, let's say we decide to use Mag Blast, and let's see what happens. We are at 15 energy, using Thermal Detonator on the next global cooldown, which brings us to 20, because we're venting 5 heat per second. And now the next global cooldown, we want to proc our Railshot. We don't have Rocket Punch available, so we're going to be using Mag Blast, which takes us to 29 energy. And this is a problem, because the next global cooldown should be an energy burst, which costs 20 heat. So we can decide either to overheat here or use our Railshot, which would be wasting 1 energy load, since you cannot have more than 4, of course. We're choosing to use Energy Burst, which takes us to over 40 heat, and this is of course a DPS loss in the long run. But now the problems are compounding, because now we have the choice to use Rocket Punch, which is coming off cooldown and would be the highest priority to use right now. But instead what we will have to do is delay it by 1 global and use Railshot first in order to fix our heat. So this is another DPS loss. Not a big one, but it's just an example to show that even if you're being careful, even if you're at 0 heat at some point, you can still mess up your heat if you're running into this pattern of having Thermal Detonator coming off cooldown at the same time when you want to Energy Burst. Especially if you combine it with a Power Yield and double Energy Burst, you need to make sure that you either anticipate a downtime or you have vent heat available to manage your heat. Next up, we're going to talk about defensive cooldowns. Now, the first one that I typically use is Power Yield. Power Yield is nice, gives you additional armor if you're running the Super Commando package, makes you invulnerable for 3 seconds. I typically use it first simply because it's part of the opener, so you're going to have this one running anyway. Energy Shield is typically the second thing I will use. I'm pretty liberal about popping Energy Shield. Juggernaut jumps at you, Energy Shield. Looks like rain tonight, Energy Shield. Mom ganks you because you forgot your homework and you are about to fail 4th grade for the 4th time, Energy Shield. So whenever something is about to hit you, use Energy Shield. Very good cooldown, and of course on PowerTech, the cooldown gets reduced. So if you're getting hit a lot and you're not dying, then you can have this up as often as once every minute. Next, I will use Sonic Missile, which gives you a 30% defense chance for 6 seconds. Keep in mind that this also works against force and tech attacks, which is quite nice because with this you can dodge knockbacks, hard stuns, and things like that, not only white damage. 4th, Hydraulic Overrides. Yes, you can say this is a kind of death cooldown because it allows you to simply get away from people Make sure to use this when you're white barred, because then you cannot get stunned, which kind of counters the effect. Finally, I will use Cold to Overload, and I typically pair this with the Warzone Adrenal for the 15% damage reduction, because by itself, Cold to Overload is really not that good on AP. You can easily be killed through it if there's more than one enemy on you, sometimes even if there's just one enemy on you. So make sure to combine this with Warzone Adrenal so you actually get value out of it. And then finally, as on all characters, usually I am using the Warzone Medpack last. Can be nice to outplay people because the 35% HP heal is kind of big. But yeah, there's nothing special about AP when it comes to Medpack. Lastly, some tips and tricks. You can move and even break LOS while casting Deadly Onslaught. Small burst combo you can do is saving up 4 stacks of energy burst, delaying your Railshot until the 4th slot of the block, then using the combination energy burst, Railshot, rocket punch, Railshot. Third tip, use vent heat as an offensive cooldown. Sometimes it's okay to expend more heat if you have vent heat available or coming up soon. So make sure to spam those magnetic blasts. Finally, Jet Charge can be used a second time within 6 seconds, which is great for escaping, getting to the middle in hypergates, scoring a hot ball, or even managing heat. Lastly, when playing AP PowerTech, remember that you are the most important person in the Warzone and everyone should treat you accordingly. So the final bonus tip I have is always make sure to ask your healers to heal only you. Make sure to flame your tank if he dares to remove your guard. And when someone stuns you, he must pay and he will be hunted, pulled into the fire trap, or chain stunned for the rest of the Warzone. That's all I have for today, guys. Hopefully this guide helped you a little bit. As always, if it did, please remember to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.
We can only count to 4. We can only count to 4. We can only count to